Hi, I'm Nick Haig. Welcome to the B2B Insights podcast and episode 2 of the CX Masters podcast. Today, I have Ian Golding with me, an internationally renowned speaker and blogger on the subject of customer experience. Ian was one of the inaugural board members of the CXPA, that's Customer Experience Professionals Association, for those that you don't know, and was the first person to become an authorised resource and training provider for the CXPA accreditation in 2015. This probably there could mean that Ian has provided training and mentoring to more CX professionals than anyone else in the world. So today we are speaking to a true expert. And if that wasn't enough, on top of all this, Ian's run his own customer experience consultancy since 2012, written a book called Customer What, and is the chairman of the judging panel at the Customer Experience Awards and the Gulf Customer Experience Awards. So, over the next 45 minutes, then I'm not sure how we're going to fit everything into today's conversation, but without further ado, let's get into it. So welcome, Ian.
Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you for such a lovely introduction. You make me blush ever so slightly.
Well, you wrote the introduction in terms of the actions and what you do for the industry. So no, it's a delight to be speaking to you today.
Thank you.
To put things into context, I'd like to understand your own personal CX journey that you've been on. Looking at your LinkedIn profile, I see that you started live client side and after university went into the finance route. But it wasn't until 10 years later that you made this jump into CX, becoming head of group CX or customer experience for Shop Direct Group.
Yes,
I'm intrigued on that journey. Had you accountants and finance people are very different to CX people. So what had you had enough of that life, and what was the catalyst for the role shift?
Sort of. When you're growing up, you will have been asked this by your mum and dad many times. What do you want to be when you're older? Right? Yeah. I don't think anyone can ever claim that they said, I want to be a customer experience specialist. My kids certainly don't want to be a customer experience specialist. But no, my father was an accountant.
Right.
My wife is an accountant. And so there was an inevitability about me ending up in financial services coming out of university. All I knew is that I didn't want to be an accountant as a result, but I was sort of thrust into financial services and spent a little bit of time whizzing around big corporate financial organisations like the Royal Bank of Scotland, like Deutsche Bank, but then ultimately ended up at GE. And At the time, I'm old enough to have started working for GE in the 90s. GE Capital was just a financial monster, still being led by Jack Welch, as you know, one of the most transformational business leaders of all time. I was suddenly put into this environment where, yes, I was working in a financial services business, but one that was this gigantic global monolith led by someone who kept saying, everything we do, we have to put the customer at the heart of it. And it was the first time in my career I'd heard a leader saying it. And it was the first time in my career that I was working in a company where they actually meant it. And I was introduced very early on in my GE career to the process improvement methodology Six Sigma. And it sounds rather extreme, but that changed my working life. And, from the minute someone explained to me that there is this methodology that's all about, doing the right thing for the customer, that they had me at hello, so to speak. It just made so much sense to me. And that has defined the rest of my working career. And my time at GE was where I started to do customer experience related work without knowing that's what it was. And it was only until I ended up in retail via outsourcing and food service that I suddenly was put into a formalized customer experience role. But even then, the world didn't know what it was. So I think, to cut a long story short, to me, being customer focused is just inbuilt in my psyche because I always wanted to do the right thing for customers. And ending up being someone who now is able to help many companies understand how to do that means that I practice my vocation. I no longer have a job, I have a vocation. And that is genuinely what it feels like.
Yeah. Well, you couldn't have had a better grounding, could you, from Jack Welch? Do you ever meet the big man?
Unfortunately, no. I met some of his henchmen, some of those who were lined up to take over from him, but I never met him personally. But he was a huge influence in my working career, without doubt. And when you worked in a company like GE at the time, because sadly GE is now a pale of what it used to be. When you worked in that company at the time, you knew you were working in something very special. And actually, when I left GE, it was a real shock to the system because GE was so sophisticated in its thinking that you come out of it and it's like, oh my word,
Not everyone's like this.
And that was a big shock. But that's why I do say that GE changed my working life, and it is that grounding that is very significant as to who I am today in influencing others.
Yeah. Well, and as you say, that was a few years back, wasn't it? And you've been involved in the field of CX ever since.
I have
nearly 25 years, quarter of a century.
Right.
So
thanks for confirming just how old I am.
well, for those of you that might see the video, then you're looking good for it, Ian.
Oh,
But now, I mean, both as a practitioner and a consultant,
yes.
and I'm thinking back. I've been in business 22 years now, but so a lot has changed over that time. What do you think have been the biggest shifts that you've seen relating to the CX industry?
Oh, I mean, it's seismic, but, and that's a word I use a lot, there is still such a long way to go. I first had CX in my job title in 2005. The professional association, though, was only created in 2011.
Yeah.
So, and I use that really as a yardstick. So, I think customer experience to a degree can trace its roots all the way back to direct marketing, the early days of direct marketing, really. But if the professional association was only founded in 2011, customer experience isn't 10 years old yet. And that's what people need to really get to grips with, because as I always say when I'm sharing knowledge with people, customer experience has always been there. I'm always asked, when is this going to come to an end? What's the next big thing going to be? And it's like, well, there will be other things that rise up to the top, but customer experience has always and will always be a big thing, because it's always been there. And the problem is companies don't quite know how to adapt to the changing environment around them. And this year is, no better example of that. So, I think what is very different today, the biggest fundamental shift is that we have absolutely, for many years now, moved away from being a product-centric business world to being a customer-centric business world. So in other words, very few companies today can differentiate on their products and services alone. Differentiation, sustaining business has to be about the whole experience. And just with, in the UK, the two big retail failures in the last week, both of those failures are completely down to the lack of evolution and, that still not differentiating on the whole experience as customer behavior changes. So I think as we move into 2021, it will continue to be companies that can evolve to become even more accessible and focus on the whole experience that are the ones that will survive long into the future. The ones that cannot adapt, either because they don't want to, or because they just don't know how, or they're prepared to change, they will cease to exist, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And I think it's Darwinian, isn't it? That we've got to evolve to adapt, and if ever there was a year like 2020, then understanding customer needs and those changing customer needs and therefore delivering against those is so crucial.
But it's down to that there's so much of this so much of everything is mindset and psychology, and retail is a brilliant example to everyone of how industries change as the environment changes around them. And having spent 7 years working for an online retailer that had, when I first started, 200 department stores, all retailers had to do 50 years ago was build shops.
Yeah.
People would come. It didn't matter whether the shop was nice or not. We didn't have anywhere else to go. And that's the problem, is that there are still retailers with the mentality that that's all you need. Have got shops, you'll be fine. But it doesn't work like that anymore. And unfortunately, too many of them are realizing too late, and that they can't recover from it. And, having seen a very traditional retailer like Littlewoods that I work for close all of their stores in 2003-04. At the time, people thought they were bonkers. But, I think people know who was the clever one now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I've had the pleasure of presenting alongside you this year, Ian, and when you were talking, you actually talked about the Golding CX framework.
Yes.
I really liked, that there's the strategy, there's the measurement, there's the people, these three
Yes.
facets. Could you just talk to our listeners about what those jigsaw pieces are that make up the puzzle?
I'm whilst being very passionate about this, I'm also very structured in the way that I encourage people to think about customer experience, because still to this day, there are people that don't quite understand it and think it's a bit soft and fluffy, but
Yeah.
It is. And I developed a framework when I went independent almost 9 years ago to allow people to understand how to put that structure in place to make the management of customer experience intentional. And as you rightly say, the framework, which is, there is no one way of doing this, but my framework is a simple way of explaining this, does contain 3 parts. And the reason I describe it as a jigsaw puzzle is that businesses need to understand, do they have the pieces? And if they have the pieces, can they connect them together? And so the strategy part of the framework is 3 very simple questions. Do you know who your customers are? Do you know what you want their experience to be? And does everyone in the organization know the role they play in delivering that experience? Now, 3 very simple questions that even more than I do, that many companies find very difficult to answer.
Yeah.
And if they find those questions difficult to answer, the measurement part of the framework becomes even more challenging, because the measurement part of the framework, I call that, because customer experience is a fact-based methodology. And this is all about determining how capable the customer journey is at delivering the first part of the framework. Now, if we can't really answer the first part of the framework, what is it that we're measuring that tells us we're doing a good job or a bad job of the customer experience? Now, we know that most companies are defaulting to financial performance. And if financial performance goes up, they all pat themselves on the back and say, aren't we brilliant? But if it goes down, everyone panics. And when they panic, everyone charges around trying to fix lots of things to see if they can get the numbers to go up. But no one knows what works and what doesn't work. This fact-based methodology is all about implementing an intentional way of continuously managing the customer journey, which includes knowing what the journey looks like, so you can measure that journey to identify the small number of priorities having the greatest detrimental effects on customer perception, and as a result, financial performance. And when you know what the priorities are, you then fix them. And you do that all over again and all over again and all over again. And, organizations like yours that have helped thousands of companies to measure the experience, this is about leveraging that measurement. What's the point of measuring it if we don't do anything with it? This is what I mean about the jigsaw puzzle, because we need businesses to understand that the customer journey is a living, breathing thing. And unless you change it and improve it based on the facts you're gathering, nothing changes. But the third part of the framework is all about people, because we can't do any of this without people. And one of the biggest learnings, again, in my opinion, of 2020 is that the clever organizations, if I can describe it that way, are the ones who have really understood this year that what sustained them is their people. Because you can't deliver experiences without them. And it doesn't matter how digitally enabled we are, we can't do this without our people. And as a result, we have got to make sure we have the right culture and environment to enable our people to think and act in the interests of customers. So very simple, holistic managing the experience, but it really does help people, and I've shared this all around the world, to get their heads around what does customer experience look like.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it, Ian, because as you say, and especially when we're talking to boards of companies, it sometimes is seen as fluffy stuff. But it's this blend of art and science within it, and you can't manage what you don't measure, but you've got to get the right things that you are measuring. But and I love that we are nothing without the people side of things. So it does encompass everything in that simplest form. I think it's very good and quick and easy for people to get their heads into. So I really like that.
Thank you.
I in doing my homework, I was looking at your website, and I regularly actually the blog pops up in terms of keeping abreast of what things you're thinking front of mind. And there was one, in fact, I know you talked about it a lot back in the past, the good old days when both of us used to fly around like silly idiots around the world doing business. But I do think I used to like the blogs that you wrote around the airline industry. You're pretty vocal around the poor experiences you encountered on your journeys, and I was just interested in terms of the worst experiences. Would you say that the airline industry is one of the worst for the service they deliver, or what do you find from a client side of perspective? Is there any particular trends from a sector?
So firstly, as a disclaimer, just in case anyone from an airline is listening, it feels wrong in a way to say negative things about an industry that's been decimated.
We can't kick them while they're down, can we?
However, it is an industry that has reaped the benefits up until 2020 of an increased globalization of movement. And many of these companies have made huge sums of money over the years, but far too many of them have been very inconsistent in the way that they have managed the experience. And a lot of that is down to a lack of understanding of what the end-to-end customer journey really means, and the lack of evolving capability within their organizations to improve experiences. I, for example, have written more than once about Emirates, who many will see as a very good airline. And in general, they are. But the problem is that customer experience isn't just about the aeroplane itself. And I think the airline industry is a very good example of one that misunderstood the difference between product and experience, because Emirates invested so much in the aircraft, but they seem to forget about everything else.
Yeah.
And so with Emirates, if nothing goes wrong, it's great because their aircraft is lovely. The problem with an Emirates is that if something goes wrong, it is horrendous. I mean, really horrendous. And actually, it's unfair to just pick on Emirates because the whole industry is the same. It's not about when it goes right. It's what do they do when it goes wrong? And no airlines seem to have understood that. And even the ones who I would argue have done a better job of customer experience, like KLM. Even KLM, some of the aspects of the journey when it goes wrong, it's shocking. And I think the lack of understanding of the effect they have on human beings. And if I'll just give an example, you may have read this one because it is my worst ever traveling example, but a 17-hour delay in Johannesburg with Emirates, which was just, it was so bad, it was funny. And well, to me, but I travel all the time and I knew it was going to happen. I knew the plane wasn't going anywhere because when you travel a lot, you just know.
Yeah.
And so I chose, because I have lots of air miles, so I'm usually sitting in a lounge waiting for the flight, but I was intrigued to see what was going to happen. So I sat at the gate and the aeroplane's sitting there and there are no lights on. All the luggage is, lined up beside it. There's not a human being. The plane's not going anywhere. But what really disappointed me is the complete lack of empathy and compassion for the passenger. And that's what gets me is that things go wrong. And I've got no problem with things going wrong, but it's how you deal with it. And, there were people that had to sleep for hours on the floor in the terminal because when they decided the plane wasn't leaving, in South Africa, you need a visa to get in. And so, but the hotels are the other side of the border. But so they weren't allowed out to go into a hotel overnight. They had to sleep on the floor. But they weren't given anything. And it's things like that that really irritate me. So I think that the airline industry is a very, very good barometer for all others, actually. But the industry, sadly, that I think is the worst isn't them. It is the telco industry. We might need an entirely separate podcast to cover that one.
Well, I was going to ask from a sector perspective. I mean, we've all got stories, and so even around the airline sector, we could talk for an hour just on that, couldn't we? I mean, but I think back to your point, and I think it's this. It comes from the top. So we started today talking about Jack Welch, didn't we? And what I couldn't believe is Ryanair, taking that position, that differentiated position of low cost, not caring about customer experience, and then Michael O'Leary comes out that we're going to focus on customer experience, but the empathy therefore isn't with his people because he's not trained them that way. And
no. Well, just look at the recent thing last week about EasyJet. Now, interesting, I've written about EasyJet as well. What most passengers don't know is that EasyJet have a customer charter. Now, most passengers won't know that because it's buried on their website, but they have a passenger charter. But last week they did something that totally contradicts that passenger charter because they are going to start charging passengers to use the overhead lockers in the plane. Now
I didn't hear that.
it is quite shocking, really. I mean, it's shocking anyway, even if they didn't have a passenger charter, that they think that they can recover some of their lost revenue by just charging passengers to put bags in an overhead locker that's already there. What mentality, thinks that that's the right thing to do?
I mean,
this is what gets me sometimes about the way businesses do things. It's like, who have they spoken to? To who has sat down and had a conversation thinking that's a good idea? I just don't get it sometimes.
No, well, they're definitely sweating the small stuff if they think that's going to make the difference, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, let's on more cheerier notes. What about the best experiences?
Well, do you know what? The best experiences for me, in a way, well, there is a link to what I've just said because I think the best experiences tend to be not where it's right all the time, but where brands are able to correct the things that go wrong, but correct it so brilliantly that you remember the way they corrected it rather than what went wrong in the beginning. Yeah. And there are lots of examples of this, but I think for me personally, sticking with travel, I've had some horrendous hotel experiences, but some of the best recovery I've ever had have been in hotels. And I had one very recently with my family, and this is going to make me sound really inappropriate, so I need to be very careful how I explain this. In October, half term, I treated the family to 2 nights at the Savoy in London. Now, I know people, so I didn't pay the normal price. Just to be clear, I can't usually afford to stay in a hotel at the Savoy. But this was a special thing. We've all been locked down, we've not gone anywhere, and we couldn't fly abroad. So I wanted to take them somewhere that would be memorable. And so everyone's very excited, and we get there, and the rooms are lovely. But the rooms they put opposite the building site. So the office, or the building next door is being renovated, and outside the window was a lift that the workmen go up and down in. Now, we arrived quite late in the afternoon, so it was quiet. But 7 o'clock the following morning, now, interestingly, and it's surprising that the Savoy didn't cotton on to that, but obviously no one had realised that that was the case, because they wouldn't have put you in the rooms otherwise, but they obviously didn't realise. But my wife was quite upset because this was special and, it upset her. So she contacted reception, not because we didn't want me to, because it just feels wrong, me moaning about it. And she said that she was a bit upset and blah, blah, blah. We went out that day. When we got back, they had moved all of us, because I'm a family of 5, they'd moved all of us, all of our luggage, everything, to a riverside suite. Now, these things cost a huge amount of money, like £5,000 a night or something ridiculous. I've never been in a room like that in my life, and it was just unbelievable. And they didn't have to do that, but oh my word, I mean, the kids will never forget it. It was quite remarkable. And the thing about it is that the Savoy is, it's an icon in that industry. They have lost millions this year. At the time we were there, about 600 of their staff had been furloughed, but they said, it doesn't matter, but that's the right thing to do. And that, I think, is what customer experience is all about. And we will never, ever forget it. And will I take the family back there? Absolutely, when I can afford to.
No, absolutely. And I think, we've all got these, it's, when you think of examples, then we've got lots in our consumer lives, haven't we? But even from some of our clients, in a B2B or industrial setting, there's one, in fact, the awards that we were at just, a couple of months ago, the UKCX Awards. Brenntag, they're a chemicals logistics supplier, and what we saw just around one of their touch points, around when they've got a complaint, and by the way, they didn't have any complaints before we started doing their tracking for them 4 years ago, but we saw this disparity between 100 points on the NPS scale. So when people have had a complaint and they haven't dealt with it, -40. When they have dealt with it, +60. And the fact, and how you can start to build relationships on the back of that, and get a more solid relationship.
Comes back to thinking.
It does.
When they fix it, it's because someone's thinking. And that's why this and computers can't think like that. And this is where the humans got to come in, and we've got to recognise that stuff goes wrong. That's life. But fix it, fix it in a way that actually the client thinks, wow, that's amazing. But fix it in a way so whatever caused the problem in the first place doesn't happen again. And that's what companies aren't doing. And so we end up, we can't repair the damage all the time, because the damage is the same thing over and over and over again. And we just haven't got the bandwidth to be able to do it. So when things go wrong, that's fine, recover it. And if that costs you money, so be it. But fix it so it doesn't happen again. That's where you get the benefit.
Yeah. And again, it's back to that jigsaw piece of the people, but it's not just the people getting it, it's empowering them to be able to make 100%, that change. 100%. Yeah. When writing my book, B2B Customer Experience, I built it on research we carried out over time. And we saw that these 6 pillars of world-class customer experience: commitment from the top down, the Jack Welchers; fulfillment, responsiveness, evolution, seamlessness, and proactivity. The Savoy being a great example of that. But over the last 5 years of tracking this data in the wider marketplace, we've seen that companies' progress is stalling, and in fact, companies struggling more than ever with some of these pillars: responsiveness and evolution, the 2 specifically. So, it's a new industry, but it's been around forever. Companies are dead if they don't understand the customer and deliver against their needs. So what's your view on why you think this is happening in the marketplace?
3 words, and this is, I think you're right, actually. This is very ingrained in B2B, but it is also in B2C. But the 3 words, and I might forget them, so you'll have to remind me, are process, complexity, and there was a third one which will come to me. I think governance. and accountability. So
Yeah.
if I start with accountability, actually, my background is in process improvement. So, as someone who has practiced Lean Six Sigma for many, many years, in my days at GE, everyone knew who was accountable for what. All right, there was absolutely no dispute as to whose neck was on the line if something didn't work. Accountability has disappeared from corporate organizations around the world. I work on every continent on earth, in almost every industry. And when I say to people, do you know who is accountable for the processes that deliver the touch points in your customer journey? They look at me with a complete blankness because they don't know. And this is a massive, massive problem. That accountability has disappeared because, whilst I can't make a generalization about all leaders of organizations, people don't want to be accountable because we've become, I think, in business, very selfish. And people are focused on their own individual goals because they want their bonus. And it's all about them, not the organization anymore. And so that lack of accountability is huge. The reason I say process is because, and some of this actually is down to Jack Welch himself, but with Toyota and GE in the 80s and 90s being so obsessed with process methodology, many businesses became obsessed with process, which is a good thing. But the problem is they've become too obsessed with process. And as a result, they're misunderstanding the marriage, as I call it, between process and journey, because processes represent the things people are doing every day. It doesn't represent what customers interact with. And process obsession actually leads to a huge amount of bureaucracy and unnecessary activity. And that connects to my third word, which is complexity. All of that has meant that organizations have become so overly complex that they are literally drowning in complexity and they can't stop. They find it almost impossible to stop. And that complexity is driven by process, but it's also driven by behavior. The amount of very highly educated, incredibly intelligent people who spend their day completing Excel spreadsheets and writing PowerPoint presentations that actually has no benefit to the customer at all. And so I think fundamentally businesses need to stop. And some have during the pandemic because they didn't have a choice. But what all industries needed to realize before this year is that's why they're being disrupted. That's why disruptors have come in, because they're coming in saying, do you know what? I don't need all of that rubbish. And they're starting without any of that, but that's what these traditional businesses, they need to wake up and smell the coffee, because if it hasn't happened to you yet, I promise you it is coming, and it will be too late because you are failing to stop. And so much of this to me is down to having the courage to say, do you know what, we're going to do this differently. And that brings me all the way back to a GE again, because Jack Welch had the courage to say, no, all right, we're not going to do it like that. Even if I go back to my Littlewoods days, and in the UK, even in the UK, people will have forgotten about Littlewoods. It won't be on the conscious minds of people, but that organization went from a gigantic retailer with 200 stores, 7 contact centers, 3 warehouses, 2 distribution centers, 20,000 employees. Today, it is a pure play online retailer, one of the most profitable retailers in the world, but it took them about 15 years to make money. But there was a recognition right at the very beginning that the business that was bought, which were 2 legacy retail, it didn't work anymore. So we're going to have to change it. How many examples like that are there? And I do hope that, whilst not everyone will like the Barclays brothers for everything that they do, I hope they look back and think with a huge amount of pride what they did to ensure that business still lives on today. Because if they hadn't, that would have gone, years ago.
Yeah.
But that's what others need to understand. Nothing is forever anymore. And I think that the word of 2020 is pivot. And if you need to pivot, so be it. That's what's going to have to happen.
Yeah. You'll always get, if you're lucky, you need to differentiate, don't you, in terms of what you're looking to do out there.
Even peers of mine, customer experience specialists who lost everything, have had to find other ways of surviving. And some of them have done amazing things. But that's what you've got to do. Nothing is forever anymore.
Yeah. 2018 must have been the year to launch a book. For those of you that can see the video, then behind Ian there's the customer what. And by the way, there's a practice what you preach. It is a very good book there, but it's subtitled "The Honest and Practical Guide to Customer Experience." If you haven't read it, listeners, I do recommend it because it does exactly that, and it is an excellent step-by-step guide of lots of different anecdotes within there, bringing it to life in terms of experiences, the good and the bad. Well, what was the catalyst for you putting this together? I don't think there is anything else out there, so maybe that was the catalyst.
Well, no, it wasn't quite that. I started writing in 2012. In fact, it was another customer experience specialist, an American guy called Mike Wittenstein, who said to me, I think it was the week I went independent, "Ian, you need to start writing." And I'd never written anything. I thought, all right, I'll give it a go. And do you know what? I quite liked it. And then I did it again and did it again. And I actually wrote at least one article every week for the following 6 years.
Right.
It just became part of what I did. And it was actually very cathartic at the time, because when you spend your whole career inside corporate organizations, you don't really have the ability to talk about what you think publicly. And now I was able to say what I thought, and it was really very refreshing. And so I liked it, I enjoyed it, people like reading it. And as I was writing, I was thinking, I'd like what I think if you write anything, and you probably had this as well, there's always that thought in your mind, I would love one day to have a book with my name on it. And so I've been thinking about it for a long time. And then with the help of a brilliant lady, another customer experience specialist who edited it for me, Beth Richardson, I thought, well, you know what, let's give it a go. And so I used a lot of my ramblings from the previous years, actually, to bring it all together with Beth's help into something that I wanted genuinely to help people. When I wrote it, I said to her, what I want is something that people can pick up, read, and do stuff. And that's what I wanted. And that's why in creating it wasn't easy. Again, you've done this, so you'll know. I made the decision to self-publish because I wanted it to be a certain size. I wanted it to have space in it for people to write in and stick things in. And that I hope is what I've achieved.
Yeah.
My favourite story actually is a guy that said to me, he used to be a client of mine, and he said to me last year, "I need you to know something, Ian." I said, "What?" He said, "I keep your book," he said, "I've read it many times, but I keep your book in the boot of my car." I said, "Oh, okay. And when I get to work every morning and get my bag out of my car, I touch your book because it gives me hope." But you know what? I thought that means a lot, actually.
Yeah, for sure.
That's sort of what it's all about. And I'm so sincere in my desire to want to help people to realize that they can do this. That this is the hardest profession I think you could ever choose to go into. And for many of us, we don't choose to go into it. We're in it. But it's so hard that if I can help others to believe that they can make that transformation happen, then that's a winner. So yeah, the book was a huge thing for me, and I still can't believe there's a book with my name on it. But whenever people send me pictures of it and it's all dog-eared and stuff sticking out of it, then I know that it's working. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the CX Bible. One eye on the clock, so I'm going to work towards the finishing quickfire questions, then, Ian, so that I can get everything in and actually aligning with talking around books. And I publish a daily quote that's taken from because there's so much I think that can be taken away just from little snippets. And when I looked at today's quote, actually it's quite aligned with the conversation we've been having here around entrepreneurship and smaller companies versus larger companies being more customer centric. It's easier for small B2B companies to please their customers. Their owners think nothing of working late into the night or over the weekend to fulfill orders. In large companies, the customer experience touches more people and is therefore more complicated to deliver. And I think it goes back to what we were talking around process, complexity, and accountability. You know, the market trader, he's got his finger on the pulse of what his customers want because he's there at the coalface. Have you got a particular quote or mantra maybe that you specific to CX?
I do, as you would expect, I have a few. There's a lot in my book, but no, the quote that I will share with you is one that I think 2020 really needs this quote to be heard by people. And it's a lady who works for a bank in South Africa. I won't name her because she's quite humble, so she doesn't like being named. But she attended one of my masterclasses a few years ago, and I always get people to introduce themselves, and she introduced herself just the same as everyone else did. But I got the impression that she was, you know, sort of mid-management, just the same as everyone else. What I didn't know is that she was very senior. And at the end of the 2 days, I told everyone, right, that's it, you can leave. She said, no, everyone just stay seated for a moment. I thought, what's going on? And she stood up, and then that's when she revealed that, you know, I'm actually quite senior and blah, blah, blah. And she said, so I need to share a thought with you, Ian, that's been going through my mind. And she said, and these are the words, I put this quote in the book because it was so profound in my opinion. I found the last 2 days really interesting because I always knew that customer experience was important, but I didn't realize it was a science. And behind the science is a heart. And, you know, for me, it really sums up that customer experience it's almost 50% head, 50% heart.
Yeah.
You know? And this is where leaders that don't get that think it's all about the heart, but it isn't. It's combining those two things together. So yeah, that is my one of my favorite quotes. My favorite quotes.
I've already mentioned it, but this year's UKCX Awards, we were lucky enough to be there, and we watched your interview with Fred Reichelt, the creator of MPS and the author of Ultimate Question. And I know, you know, when you were interviewing him, you said he was one of your heroes or people that had inspired you. And we've talked of Jack Welch as well. But is it one of those two, or is there anyone else that's influenced your career?
So Jack Welch is definitely very pivotal in everything for me. But no, there's one other person who I don't think I've ever told because I've not been able to find her. But I spent a couple of years working for a GE Capital business that was a reinsurance business. And my boss was in St. Louis in the US. And she was brilliant, absolutely amazing. Now, I only ever met her in person once, bizarrely. And that's what always makes me laugh about 2020 is that people think this is the only time in anyone's lives that people have communicated, you know, like this. But no, I've been doing it for years.
Yeah.
But she was just a remarkable person because she would always allow me to think and act in the way that I thought was right. She would always listen to me and allow me to do what I thought was the right thing. And what fascinates me is that when I think back, the best leaders who have influenced me have been parents. You know, and I think she had 5 kids at the time, but she listened. You know, she listened and she didn't direct and, you know, order. She listened and allowed me to do what was right. And I'll never forget her. And I think it's leaders like that that give us the confidence to know that we can make a difference.
Yeah.
And people like that, you know, everyone will have a leader like that in their mind. And maybe what I should say is if you're listening to this, go on LinkedIn and find them and send them an email and say thank you. So maybe I'll see if I can find her. I haven't looked for a while, so maybe I'll try again.
No, these people, you know, whether it's a leader in industry, a teacher even, you know, it's you don't forget them, do you, once they've impacted your life like that. And in wrap up, Ian, I'm a keen reader, and as I know you are too, I've always got a few books on the go. But in terms of or discounting Customer What, your book, would you recommend anything else to listeners to read up specific?
Right now, I will do, because I'm not a particularly avid reader. The book that many of my mentees love reading is Outside In by Kerry Bodine. So that's definitely one I recommend. But no, there is a new book that I'm recommending to people, written by a very good friend of mine, who is just coincidentally one of the nicest human beings on earth. But he shares our view for practicality. And so, in fact, I have it behind me, and it is this, if you can see it. It's the Journey Mapping Playbook, written by Jerry Angrave. He's written this because, as we know, people have become obsessed with journey mapping, but they don't really know how to do it, and they don't really know what to do with it. And Jerry has written something that is it's not quite the dummy's guide, but if you are planning on mapping a journey and don't know what to do, this is well worth investing in. So that's my recommendation. Plus, he's such a lovely man. Buy his book. Yeah.
Well, we started today the first question was asking about your journey and how you'd started it, and we finished it in talking about the journey. And of course, understanding that end-to-end journey is so important in customer experiencing. We could have doubled our time today.
I'm sure.
And so maybe there even needs to be a follow-up podcast. But Ian, I need to thank you again for your valuable time out of your day. To our listeners, if they want to get in touch, usual channels, LinkedIn, Twitter.
Usual channels. In fact, some say that you cannot avoid my ugly face on LinkedIn. But if you're not connected to me already, then LinkedIn is probably the place to go.
Fantastic. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Again, learned some things along the way, and that's the way it should be. Always learning. So thank you again, Ian.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for asking me, Nick, and I hope everyone listening has enjoyed the conversation.
Well, I certainly have. So thank you.
Thank